Taj stood atop the narrow crest of limestone just as first light loosened its pale grip on the glaciers below. The cold wind, heavy with the scent of broken ice and distant pine, coursed through his shaggy coat, ruffling each coarse strand like static against granite. Round him, the Alps unfurled in the silent chorus of jagged peaks and shadowed couloirs, each snow-clad summit etched against the sky transitioning from violet to rose. From this exalted vantage, 4,000 meters above the valley floor, Taj surveyed his realm with practiced stillness, hooves planted firmly on frost-hardened rock, head raised in quiet vigilance. For years, he had learned the mountain's every secret, the tremor of hidden crevasses, the thin seams where wind scoured the snow into glassy drifts, the soft hiss where marauding rockfall had buried its warning beneath fresh powder. His own breath came in measured plumes of steam, and each intake of rarefied air strengthened the muscles that carried him along knife-edged ridges and steep arêtes where a single misstep could spell doom. Yet for all its peril, this sheer solitude had become home, a cathedral of stone and ice where Taj's goat-like grace felt as ordained as a hawk's in the thermals above. Below, almost imperceptible against the brightening slopes, two figures picked their way up the snowfield, ice axes in hand, boots crunching through layers of firm powder. The climbers, husband and wife, perhaps, moved slowly but steadily, their tracks forming a dotted line of human endeavor climbing toward Taj's realm. He watched them with courteous curiosity, aware that to them his presence was a flicker of vivid russet fur against the world's white vastness. Though they seemed confident, pausing now and then to adjust packs or sip hot tea from flasks, the mountain did not suffer complacency. Every step they took sent invisible tremors through the snowpack, and each silent echo carried Taj's attention. As the sun's low rays crested a neighboring ridge, sculpting each avalanche chute in high relief, Taj sensed a change in the air's tenor. A subtle vibration shivered through the ground beneath his hooves, like the breath of some ancient beast stirring from winter's torpor. It was too faint for the climbers to feel, a silent quiver rather than a roar, but to Taj's seasoned instincts it spoke of unstable snow layered atop hidden ice lenses. He flicked his ears, nostrils widening, and pressed all four limbs into the ledge, muscles coiling like drawn springs. The world held its breath in that suspended moment. The climbers paused mid-stride, heads turned upward, and Taj drew in one final lungful of crisp, thinning air. Then, with the guttural bleat that split the dawn's fragile hush, he hurled his warning across the heights. His cry rolled down the mountain like a gunshot, ricocheting off cliff faces, rattling loose a few pebbles that skittered across the ice. In that instant, Taj embodied the mountain's voice, urgent, unignorable, insistent upon heat. And far below, where the climbers' hearts thudded in sudden alarm, a pulse of awareness ignited. They knew, in that echoing bleat, that something far greater and vaster than their own courage had spoken. It was the first chapter of the mountain's story that day, a story Taj had long read in its stones and snows, now delivered in his thunderous warning to those who dared ascend toward the sun. Taj's breath came in steady, frosted puffs as he shifted his weight onto the balls of his hooves, each step careful yet intent upon a single purpose, to read the mountain through the snow beneath his feet. The dawn light, now pale gold against the still glistening cornices, revealed every contour of the slope, from the razor-thin knife edge where one slip would mean 1,000-meter fall, to the gentle convex hollows where wind had sculpted hidden drifts. Taj felt the fine granules of snow compress and settle under his hoof, then spring back with just enough give to betray the presence of weaker layers below. That subtle rebound, almost imperceptible, spoke urgently of a hidden fault line in the snowpack, a thin lens of ice or wind-packed powder waiting to fracture under pressure. Round him, the world was a silent symphony of shifting shapes, distant glaciers hummed with the slow freeze of morning rays, vertical seracs cast deep, cobalt shadows, and the faint hiss of melting snow whispered through sun-warmed outcrops. Taj's ears twitched at every nuance, the soft scrape of ice against stone, the distant rumble that might have been nothing more than a distant avalanche on a neighboring peak. Yet to his seasoned instincts, that low-frequency vibration was not chance but communication, a rehearsing of mass and gravity that could crescendo into roaring movement within heartbeats. He lowered his head to taste the air, nostrils flaring against the tang of fresh meltwater and the stale ghost of last winter's storms. Each inhalation confirmed what his hooves had already told him: the mountain's breath was tightening, and the air itself trembled with warning. In that moment, Taj's world contracted to the small patch of slope before him and the narrow ridge above where the climbers still ascended, unaware of the impending peril. He felt the snow's crust fracture in microscopic splinters beneath his hoof, a dry crackle like frozen twigs snapping in a forest. His heart pounded in his broad chest as adrenaline coursed through his sinewy legs. The goats of his herd had taught him to trust these tremors, to interpret the mountain's subtle language of micro-shifts and soft murmurs, but this was the first time he must translate such a warning into action for others. He glanced toward the narrow tongue of snow that led the climbers upward, a path that now lay atop a precarious bed of unconsolidated powder, and knew that every second of delay could prove fatal. With muscles coiled like drawn bows, Taj turned his head toward the unsuspecting figures below. Their shapes were small against the vast expanse, a man and a woman tracing footsteps into the receding twilight of night's chill. The man paused to adjust his pack, the woman lifted an ice axe to test the snow's firmness, and neither sensed the trembling doom gathering beneath them. Taj's eyes, dark and luminous with urgency, narrowed as he calculated the distance and angle needed to project his warning most clearly. To stand still would be to condemn them, to delay would be to bet their lives on hope alone. He reared up on his hind legs, front hooves slamming into the snow with a thunder that reverberated across the slopes. His cry, a guttural bleat sharpened by desperation, broke through the hush like a gunshot. The sound rolled down the mountainside in waves, rattling loose mica flakes on the rock faces and sending a spray of spindrift whirling into the air. Down in the narrow gully where the climbers toiled, the echo of that cry struck them like a physical blow. The man's ice axe clattered to the ground, and the woman whipped her head skyward, eyes wide in dawning comprehension. In the space of a heartbeat, the world shifted, the snowpack groaned under renewed weight, and a thin plume of powder lifted from the ridge above as if a giant exhaled in warning. Taj sank back onto all fours, turning his gaze toward the highest crest where the avalanche would begin, ready to bound for higher ground once his warning had been heeded. Below, the climbers froze, hearts pounding in their chests as the mountain's own herald made its message impossible to ignore. And as the first distant roar began to echo through the valleys, Taj stood unwavering, his silent vigilance transformed into an urgent cry of rescue, the embodiment of the Alpine goat's ancient pact, to guard those who dared to scale his sacred heights. The climbers pressed their boots into the narrow snow lip of the ridge, each footfall a muted crunch that echoed faintly off the jagged walls of granite flutings on either side. The air at this altitude was thin, each inhalation a gulp of icy emptiness that left their lungs aching for more, and sweat froze into tiny crystals on their neck gaiters. They moved in deliberate unison, one's ice axe buried firmly in hard snow, the other's crampons scoring the icy crust, but every step felt like dancing on a blade's edge. Below them, the mountain fell away in a sheer drop of rock and ice. Above, the sky blistered an impossible blue, as if daring them to ascend further. Shards of sunlight glazed the snowpack in dazzling white, obscuring the subtle contours that betrayed hidden crevasses and wind-scoured scours. The man paused to wipe his fog goggles free, fingers stiff with cold, and looked back at the slope they had just conquered, a steep expanse of brittle ice that had required every ounce of concentration and control. His partner, strapped into a harness and clipped to a thin steel rope, tested the next step with her axe, probing for solid grip. Though the rope linked them together, it could do little to catch them should the mountain's hidden weakness give way. Every muscle in her legs trembled with fatigue, every heartbeat seemed to vibrate through the soles of her boots into the living stone beneath. A sudden gust of wind tore across the ridge, rattling loose flakes of fresh powder that cascaded like silver rain. The climbers braced against it, bodies bent forward, as the snow whirled into the air, turning the bright day into a momentary ghost scene. They lifted their heads only to see the cornice above them, a delicate overhang of wind-packed snow, arching outward like a frozen wave ready to break. Where sunlight had warmed its crest, the snow glinted dangerously thin, its underside already orange from early morning's heat. The woman froze, ice axe held aloft, and her breath panted in her throat as she realized they were walking directly under that precarious ledge. One false move, one misjudged step, and their world might collapse into an avalanche of shattering sound and unrelenting power. He reached out a gloved hand to steady her, voice low so as not to disturb the mountain's fragile hush. "Careful," he murmured, heart thudding in his ears louder than the wind. "We need to move slowly, keep our way to the left of that overhang. Every gram matters." She nodded, sending a faint tremor through the rope that was their lifeline. Together, they edged forward, grinding crampons into the hard pack and planting each pick with painstaking precision. The wind shifted again, more insistent this time, and the cornice quivered atop its icy pedestal, an ominous ripple that set their nerves jangling like taut cables. Sweat lashed cold down their backs as they inched beneath the deadly ledge, bodies pressed tight against the steely backbone of the ridge. The man's ice axe bit deep into a vertical seam of firm, and he dug in his heels, shifting his pack's weight to create a stable platform. Above, the cornice trembled once more, and a thin ribbon of snow peeled away, drifting earthward in slow motion. The woman's heart seized as she watched the arc of powder, then clenched her teeth and moved onward. Each footfall carried them farther into the mountain's belly, into the very throat of peril. A distant rumble reached them, barely more than a whisper yet resonant enough to ripple through the snow around their boots. It felt like the low drone of some great beast stirring from slumber, a sound too deep for human vocal cords yet too clear to ignore. They froze, axes suspended in midair, heads whipping toward the ridge crest they had just passed. The man's voice, hushed and urgent, broke the silence. That sounded like moving snow. Did you feel that? She nodded, eyes wide beneath her goggles. As the knowledge dawned, the mountain was speaking, its hidden layers shifting beneath the sun's inexorable warmth, and they were caught squarely in its crosshairs. He glanced upward, scanning the pale cornice that now bulged dangerously above them, each hourglass of snow on its underside marking time until collapse. They shared a look of wordless accord, each understanding the other's fear and duty, to live, to warn, to survive. With surging adrenaline, he shouted a staccato warning to the woman, whose quick nod sent a pulse of tension down the rope. Their retreat would be as perilous as their advance. But advance was death. Slowly, impossibly slowly, they began to back away from the overhang, spitting into their gloves to clear the ice, each step a vow to respect the mountain's silent code. Beneath their careful retreat, the ridge breathed a sigh, and the avalanche's first peal rang out, a thunderous crack that shattered the fragile calm and sent a roar down the slopes below. Taj, perched high above on a jutting spire, heard the collision of ice and snow like a cannon shot. His urgent bleat cut through the aftermath's roar, a cry that had sounded days before, deep in his mountain's breast, warning of this very moment. As the avalanche thundered, shattering the air and rewriting the landscape, the climbers clung to the ridge, hearts hammering, shaken by the mountain's primal fury in the deadly dance they had narrowly escaped. In that frenzied roar, they understood the true gift of warning, the chance to choose life over oblivion on the knife-edged heights of the world. Taj lunged forward as the first sheets of snow began to roil down the far slopes, his strong forelegs tensing before propelling him into a full-throated bleat that shattered the eerie calm. The sound ripped through the icy air, clattering off frozen pinnacles and ricocheting into each nearby couloir like gunfire. He braced himself on the narrow ridge, fur rippling against the wind, and let out another staccato call, one bleat, two bleats, three, each a desperate punctuation that carried straight into the hearts of the climbers below. In that instant, the mountain itself seemed to answer, a distant crack, like the trunk of a great tree splitting, echoed back in confirmation. The avalanche that was about to break loose gulped in expectation, but for Taj and those who heard him, that thunderous reply was no longer a harbinger of doom, but a signal that action could still turn fate. Below, the climbers froze mid-step, ice axes poised in the brittle snow. The man's eyes snapped toward the ridge where Taj's silhouette stood out in a flash of russet against the white expanse. He tugged sharply on the rope tethering them, turning to his partner with a look of alarm sharpened by relief. The woman's cheeks paled as she realized the animal's cry was not mere wildlife song but the mountain's own alarm bell, one she had hoped to never hear on this knife-edge ascent. Their boots dipped carefully into the stealth scree they had trod only moments before, and without a word they began to leap sideways, edging away from the weak snowpack that had been trembling to its breaking point. Taj watched with keen satisfaction as the climbers stumbled into a shallow recess in the rock, huddling against a granite buttress where the avalanche's first pulse would divert around them. Even as they pressed their bodies low against the stone, Taj knew there were others to warn, the lower team straggling behind and the rescue party camped farther down in the high pasture. He sprang from the ridge's crest and bounded along the narrow ledge that connected to the next vantage point, hooves scooping grip in the icy crust as he angled toward a second outcrop. Each leap carried his warning farther, his bleat tearing through the mountain like a bolt of living urgency, arcing down to the lower slopes where faint figures were silhouetted against the morning light. On the lower plateau, two guides, burly men in bright parkas, paused in their own reconnaissance, the jingle of their climbing gear stilled by Taj's urgent call. One tugged at his binoculars, sweeping them across the far ridges until he made out a distant flash of movement on the high crest. There, the goat's red coat billowed against the snowdrift like a banner. The guides exchanged a swift nod and raced toward the safer ground, falling into a practiced scramble that would have been impossible without Taj's timely alert. His cry had bridged the yawning gaps between them, forging a lifeline of sound through the frozen heights. Even as the guides fled to warn the camp, the avalanche finally broke, a thunderous cascade that billowed white smoke and shattered rock in its wake. Taj stood his ground, hooves planted innocently as the wall of snow roared past, missing him by mere meters. He dipped his head respectfully to the mountain's raw power, acknowledging the fury he had helped avert from claiming more lives. As the final echoes of the snow's descent dissolved into the valleys below, Taj turned and trotted back toward the summit, his mission complete. He had sounded the mountain's own horn and steered every climber beneath its shadow away from destruction. By the time the rescue teams reached the trembling rock ledges, the threatened path lay buried in a silent grave of powder. The climbers huddled together, faces pressed into balaclavas, letting the coarse wool brush their tears. They knew that without one goat's fierce vigilance, without his keening cry slicing through the dawn, they would have been swept into that roaring maelstrom. Taj reappeared at the ridge's edge, his coat matted with snowmelt and flecks of shattered ice, and in his dark, steady eyes lay the quiet pride of one who had read the mountain's secret heartbeat and become its chosen herald of life. Taj waited only a moment atop the shattered ridge before sensing the tremors of distant boots, as though some had not heeded his cry, caught unawares by the avalanche's thunder. He turned his head and scanned the slopes below, where a pair of climbers, too low on the mountain, stood frozen on a narrow ledge, their eyes wide with panic and breath clouding like pale ghosts in the cold air. Their rope tethered to an ice screw that sparkled dangerously in the sunlight, they teetered at the edge of an abyss carved by the avalanche's power, the path they had climbed now sealed in a billow of powder. Taj's heart thundered as he leapt from his perch, hooves skidding on the icy crust, and bounded across the narrow snow lip toward them, his red coat a blood-bright promise against the white expanse. Each bound was a measured prayer, hooves skimming over unseen voids, muscles coiling and releasing with mountain-born strength. As he neared the stranded pair, their heads turned in astonishment, human figures dwarfed by the goat's magnificent frame, yet comforted by his fearless approach. Taj planted his forehoofs in the snow beside them and let out a deep, rolling bleat that vibrated through their chests like a living drum. The crash of his bleat carried urgency neither machine nor man could replicate, and the climbers flinched, gripping their axes and letting the rope slacken as they fought to still their racing hearts. Taj pressed forward, nudging one climber gently with his muzzle, guiding him toward a hidden cairn where a narrow shelf of solid rock offered sure footing. He pivoted, bleeding again, and the woman followed in his wake, crampons clicking as she edged along the ledge he had chosen. With each step, Taj's steady presence anchored their trembling spirits. His dark eyes glowed with the quiet insistence that they trust his judgment, that life lay ahead if only they would follow. Behind them, the avalanche's distant roar receded, and the mountain exhaled its release, carving a corridor of peace through the fallen snow. Once the pair reached the safer plateau, where seasoned guides waited with ropes and harnesses to usher them home, Taj lingered only to ensure no other souls remained stranded amid the labyrinth of ice. He angled his crest toward a farther ridge and let out a single, clear yodeling bleat, summoning any lost climbers into his call. Then, with a final, graceful leap, he sprang back toward the summit, hooves clicking against the rock, as though to say, "This path is safe, go now, before the mountain's breath turns once more to danger." In his wake, the saved climbers wept and laughed in relief, voices lifted high to thank the Alpine goat whose unyielding cry had rallied the stragglers and turned catastrophe into salvation on the heights of the world. The roar hit like the crack of 1,000 thunderclaps, rolling down the mountainside in a wall of snow and ice that blotted out the sun. Taj's heart hammered as he stood on the lip of the ridge, every muscle taut beneath his shaggy coat, hooves braced against the stinging spray of airborne crystals. The avalanche cascaded toward the climbers below with unstoppable force, a living tide of white thunder that flattened everything in its path. For a moment, time slowed, Taj's breath billowed in long, ghostly plumes, and the world became a swirling tempest of fractured light and deafening noise. Then, instinct took over. With a fierce bleat that cut through the roar, Taj wheeled and bounded down the slope, not toward safety, but directly into the avalanche's path. Each bound carried him deeper into the wall of falling snow, his horns carved a path, his strong legs propelled him through the choking cloud. As he charged, Taj lashed out with his forehoofs, shattering unstable shelves of cornice and averting smaller slides away from the climber's refuge. The avalanche's momentum splintered around him in crashing waves, and Taj's bright coat was soon coated in swirling snow. Yet he pressed on, running upstream of the flow as though the mountain had become an ocean and he its lone breaker. Below, the climbers, huddled against a rocky overhang, heard Taj's bleat above the avalanche's fury, a clarion call that defied gravity and danger. They scrambled to their feet in the swirling storm, eyes straining through the spray for the goat's vivid silhouette. When they saw him, they understood, this was no ordinary animal, but their guardian, cutting them a corridor of safety through the chaos. One by one, they lunged into the narrow chute Taj had forged, crampons scraping on granite as they followed him up and out of the avalanche's maw. Taj did not stop once the last climber was clear. He darted back and forth along the chute's edge, stamping his hooves and bellowing until even the smallest sheets of snow slowed their fall. Every time a plume of powder threatened the ledge, Taj reared up on his hind legs, horns gleaming, and swung his head in defiance, an unmistakable signal to keep moving. He beckoned the climbers onward, guiding them across unstable spots where hidden holes yawned beneath fresh drifts. His breath steamed in the cold air, a living banner against the mountain's wrath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity squeezed into seconds, the avalanche's roar dwindled to a low rumble, then to a distant sigh. The mountain exhaled, and the storm of ice abated to a hush broken only by the soft hiss of settling snow. Taj stood panting at the ridge's crest, his coat plastered with slush and spindrift, every hoof dripping with meltwater. Below him, the climbers gathered on the higher plateau, faces pale but alive, bodies trembling with shock and gratitude. They reached up as one, voicing a choral cry of thanks that echoed through the couloirs, carrying their relief and awe back to Taj's vigilant ears. As the climbers embraced beneath the rising sun, Taj loped back toward the summit with a proud, measured gait. Behind him lay the path he had carved, a narrow scar on the avalanche's white expanse, proof that courage and swift warning could turn the mountain's deadliest moment into a deliverance. And as he perched once more on the cold crest, the world quiet at last, Taj felt the mountain's ancient pulse settle beneath his hooves, secure in the knowledge that his early warning cry and fearless stand had saved lives from the sea of ice. As the first rosy fingers of dawn unfurled across the high plateau, the world felt washed anew, every ridge and spur painted in gentle hues of pink and gold, the air now warm enough to turn the frozen breaths of the night into misty threads that drifted lazily between the rocks. Taj the Alpine goat stood at the crest where he had first sounded his urgent cry, his shaggy coat still flecked with the avalanche's final spray of ice. Below him, the rescued climbers gathered in clusters around makeshift fires that crackled with dry pine needles, faces softened by sleep and relief, eyes bright with gratitude that shone more vividly than any headlamp ever could. One by one, the pair he had worn so daringly crept forward, boots crunching carefully over the settling snow, and knelt before him on the hard-packed ground. The man, still trembling from the night's terror, offered Taj a handful of grated alpine herbs wrapped in a bit of cloth, an improvised treat rich with the mountain's flavors and a gesture laden with thanks. The goat sniffed it warily, then accepted the gift, chewing thoughtfully as the climber's partner stroked his muzzle in reverent silence. Round them, other survivors pressed forward, each laying small offerings at Taj's hooves, a silver pin from a mountaineer's vest, a scrap of bright fabric, a chipped ice axe. It mattered not what, only that each token represented a life spared. As the sun crept higher, warming the plateau, the rescued expedition set about rebuilding a semblance of camp. Tents that had been abandoned in the pre-dawn panic rose once more like hopeful blooms, ropes were tightened on support lines, and tea began to simmer in kettles rigged over the embers. Taj watched from a nearby boulder, ears rotating to catch every sound, the soft hum of a small radio calling for helicopter evacuation, the careful clang of gear being checked, the quiet laughter of children who had been airlifted in earlier and now scampered through the snow, their bright jackets streaks of color against the white. By mid-morning, a small ceremony took shape beneath the plateau's jagged backdrop. The expedition leader, wrapped in an insulated parka, stepped forward and spoke in a firm but gentle voice, addressing both the people and the mountain itself. He recounted how, in the darkest hour, a lone goat had raised its voice to avert catastrophe, how Taj's urgent bleats had been the single thread of warning that allowed lives to be saved. Then, with deliberate care, the climbers built a cairn of stone, a tower of rocks that reached toward the sky, at the spot where Taj had first given his warning. At its summit, they placed a carved wooden plaque bearing a simple inscription, in honor of Taj, guardian of the heights. As the ceremony concluded, Taj approached the cairn, nudging the plaque with his nose, sniffing at the stones stacked in his honor. The survivors formed a circle, hands linked, murmuring words of thanks that drifted up like a prayer. Sunlight fell across the cairn, casting a radiant halo around Taj's proud silhouette. In that moment, amid the gentle warmth, the shared relief, and the mountain's silent promise, every heart present recognized the profound gift they had been given, not merely the saving of their lives, but the unforgettable bond between humankind and the wild spirit that watched over them from the heights.